Okay, we're going to look at Mark 7, 1 through 22. This passage is commonly used to show that Jesus declared that all foods were now clean, that we didn't have to worry about consuming unclean animals anymore, that we would be free to do that if we wanted to. But I think if we look a little bit deeper, it becomes pretty clear that wasn't his intent at all, and that perhaps we might be reading that in the wrong way. So let's just start by reading through the passage, starting in verse 1. This is the English Standard Version. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? And he said to them, Well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And he said to them, You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, If a man tells his father or his mother, Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do. And he called the people to him again, and said to them, Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. Okay, so now I'm going to show how to use the website called Bible Hub. So we're going to look up this verse right here that says, Thus he declared all foods clean. So it's Mark 7:19. So I'm going to open up a new window. So I just type in Mark 7:19, and then I put the word hub next to it because it helps it pop up first. So the first one, Bible Hub, you just click that. And then you can see all the different translations here. So just a couple of them, they're kind of worded differently. New International Version, for it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. New Living Translation, food doesn't go into your heart, but only passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer. By saying this, he declared that every kind of food is acceptable in God's eyes. So you can kind of see some of the different translations. They're all basically saying that Jesus has declared all foods clean. So if you scroll up here and click on interlinear, this gives you just like a raw translation of the original Greek text. So it's kind of jumbled just because these are just like exactly what these Greek words mean, but I'll just read it anyway. Because not it enters of him into the heart, but into the belly and into the draught, goes out, purifying all the food. So nowhere in here do we see that it says Jesus is declaring all foods clean or acceptable in God's eyes. And I think what's even more interesting is if you read the whole text like we just did in context, they're not even talking about clean and unclean animals. They're talking about washing of the hands. So the Pharisees were saying, they were kind of trying to corner Jesus, saying, like, why don't you and your disciples wash your hands like we and, the elders do? Why don't you follow the traditions of the elders? Well, when I used to read that, I thought that those traditions were from the Torah. I thought that God commanded them and that Jesus was teaching against them. However, we know that Jesus couldn't have taught against the Torah because he would have failed the Deuteronomy 13 test of a true prophet. And we know that sin is defined as breaking God's Torah, transgressing it. So if he would have done that, he would have sinned. And we know that Jesus was a perfect, sinless sacrifice. He needed to be sinless in order to be able to redeem us, through his death and resurrection on the cross. So we know Jesus couldn't have been teaching against the Torah. So if you go back to that passage and read it over again, Jesus quotes this verse from Isaiah. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So we see even Jesus is explaining that these traditions that the Pharisees are talking about are commandments of men that, they've added on to God's law, which in Deuteronomy 4:2, God says not to do. He says, don't add or take away from these instructions that I've given to you. So Jesus continues to show the Pharisees that, it's what comes out of your heart. It's not about this like outward show of doing all of these extra man-made laws that they've tacked onto God's law to appear to be righteous. It's about what comes out of your heart that matters, because you can be doing all of these, man-made laws and works and appear very righteous on the outside, but if your heart is dirty and yucky on the inside, what's the point? Like, that's what really matters. And so he's telling them it doesn't matter if you wash your hands or not. Like, what matters is what comes out of your heart. And it's important not to forsake God's commandments, just for the sake of keeping these man-made commandments. So I believe that this, where it says here, thus he declared all foods clean, I think that's a mistranslation. I don't think that the translators were being honest with the text there. Like, this passage is not talking about clean and unclean animals at all. If Jesus was teaching that people could now eat unclean animals, he would have been sinning, and he would not have been a perfect sacrifice for us. So I think in order to be more honest with the text, that translation should be changed. So I think that's all I wanted to share. But yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of how you can use Bible Hub. It's a really cool website. If you're interested in looking at what the different words mean in Greek or in Hebrew, if you're in the Old Testament, you can just click on the number above the word like that, and it gives you the translation of the word, just like a really raw definition for that word. So this can be really helpful when as you're studying the Bible. So I hope you found this interesting and informative, and I just hope that you will be encouraged to test this for yourself. Don't take my word for it, but go and test it to the Word of God. Thanks for listening. There's actually 2 more things that I wanted to share, which I just remembered. The first is that the Berean literal Bible translation here, I think, is a pretty accurate translation of the original text. It says, because it does not enter into his heart, but into the belly, and goes out into the sewer, thus purifying all the foods. The King James Bible version is also similar. It says, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all the meats. However, when we look back at the interlinear, we see that it does say purifying all the food, not purging all the meats. However, in the original Greek and Hebrew text, they didn't have punctuation. So the King James Version, I think, gets that right, because they included the part about purging the food as a part of Jesus' statement, whereas the Berean Literal Bible puts it in parentheses, almost like it's clarifying a statement that Jesus made. We can look at it here. Because it does not enter into his heart, but into the belly, and goes out into the sewer, thus purging all the foods. And in other translations, it says stuff like, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods are now acceptable in God's eyes. But as we saw in the original Greek, that's really adding a lot of words to the original text, and I think it really changes the meaning. I'm sure you've heard the example of let's eat, comma, grandma, versus let's eat, grandma. One of those sentences you're eating with your grandma, and the other sentence you are eating your grandma. So I think punctuation is important because it can sometimes change the meaning of a sentence. So I think it would be more honest and accurate to leave the parentheses out and translate this verse as you see it right here. Because it does not enter into his heart, but into the belly, and goes out into the sewer, purifying all the foods. I believe that was part of Jesus's statement in saying that, basically kind of talking about germs or whatever was on their hands, that doesn't defile them. It's what comes out of your heart, that is important. So that's just why I think it's important that we are careful when reading our English translations. I'm not saying to throw them out at all. I'm just suggesting that we're just more careful about it. If it contradicts something in the Old Testament, maybe we should dig a little bit deeper. And Bible Hub is a great tool to be able to do that. So I hope that this was helpful and thought-provoking for you. Thanks again for listening.